Do you think the United States is neglecting her role in Africa simply because black life don't matter or African life don't matter?
No, not at all. I think the Cameroon crisis, by its very nature, is so fragmented and so complicated that the United States government has a lot of problems focusing on it. And I'll give you an example. It seems like the fighting in the bush is getting more and more undisciplined. By that I mean, for example, recent reports of splinter groups kidnapping fighters from other groups and changing the nature of it from a liberation struggle to an extortion and kidnapping struggle. So that's what's happening on the ground. It's confusing. Then what's happening amongst the diaspora community and the leadership of the diaspora community. You have a number of different organizations that refer to themselves as interim government. That's just the way it is. Then you have even the entire community is divided because you have some people that are strongly advocating for a stronger federation, other people that are advocating for independence. So when you're a U.S. policymaker and you're trying to decide on what policy to follow, what in the world are you supposed to do? Because you have different groups of Cameroonians coming in and advocating different positions. So the one standard position then that the U.S. government can take would be to oppose the human rights violations, to call on the government to exercise discipline, to call on the groups to exercise discipline, but without a unity in the struggle, either unity of purpose or unity of structure, it's going to remain very convoluted, complicated, and it's not, I'll be honest with you guys, again, I believe in telling the truth. There's not going to be any progress, and we can be having the same conversation in a year, in 5 years, or even 10 years, with the only change that more people have died, more kids have been left out of school and uneducated, to where you have an entire generation of Anglophone Cameroonians who don't know how to read and write. So, my call is that there has to be some discipline, both on the ground and in the community. But really your comments need to go to the Cameroonian diaspora, because as long as, maybe 99% of the people on the ground support independence, but not 99% of the intelligentsia and the elites in the Cameroonian diaspora support independence. So your argument really has to go to them, because I tell you, as long as representatives, write articles, engage with policymakers in the United States government, and advocate for federation, then that's going to sow a certain amount of confusion. I mean, you look at liberation struggles across Africa, and the ones that have succeeded were the ones where you've had a unity of purpose and a unity of structure. The SPLM, SPLA in South Sudan, for example, the EPLF in Eritrea, of course the Somali National Army in Somaliland. But as long as you have this fragmentation, all you get is confusion. Because, again, truth and honesty, and I'm sorry to, if somebody will not like this, but in the United States, I would guess that about 8 out of 10 people have never heard of Cameroon, let alone Ambazonia. Certainly amongst a certain sector, people have, but if you ask people on the street, they will not have any idea. So the message, that's why it is so important in a issue like Ambazonia, Southern Cameroon, there has to be absolutely a unified message. And as long as different groups show up in congressional offices advocating different points of view, the situation is going to go on as it is. And that is the truth. They will get the same, reception as say, members of the various interim governments, which I believe at last count there are at least 4 interim governments.
Well, would that be a joke? Mr. Ambassador, would that be a joke? There are now 5. So. I'm sorry.
And let me add one thing there, because I was really disappointed. October 1 is Ambazonia's National Day. And I was thinking, okay, these interim governments, sure, they disagree on a lot of things, but why not issue a statement with all the interim governments signing on commemorating Ambazonia National Day? That would have been such an easy thing, and it would have been at least something that obviously they could all agree to. But did anyone think of that? Obviously not.
What advice would you give forces on the ground, and what advice would you give the political leadership in the diaspora?
Of course, obviously, I cannot advocate for any kind of violence, but all I can say is that unity, because if the groups in the diaspora at least could agree on anything at all, I mean anything, even if when's the date of the full moon, if they could agree on that and form a common group to engage on behalf of the struggle, then that would be tremendously significant, I think, to policymakers in Washington. On the ground, all I can say is that the liberation struggles which have succeeded, in each of those, the liberation fighters were seen to be on the side of the people. And when, the struggle on the ground closes schools and kills teachers and kidnaps priests, and they kidnap people from each other, then that has a threat of turning the conflict into the type of thing that happened in Liberia or is happening in the eastern Congo, not the type of thing that happened in South Sudan. So from my point of view, unity and discipline, those two things are absolutely critical, but liberation struggles need unity and discipline. And without that, it just becomes a bunch of hoodlums running around the bush. Have you had the opportunity to take international media on the ground so they could actually, go with the boys who are in the bush to see what they are doing?
Yes, we have, and they have been stopped. Last year, I went in with an American-based news organs. We could not be able to penetrate the border because of control. The Cameroon state have rejected many applications because they will have to come legally. The Cameroon state have even rejected the coming of the Human Rights Watch, their activists to come from in the ground. So this should tell the world that what news is coming out from that country is not very reliable, unfortunately.
Because during the SPLA struggle in South Sudan, many times they took journalists with them, into the country to actually get a first-hand view of what was going on. I cannot imagine that they entered the country through the border checkpoints with Sudan at the time. But to get your story out, you have to get your story out. That's just the way it is, because you guys are media guys, so you understand that. But again, members of Congress get 20-page letters from different members of the community, and you know what you do with a 20-page letter? You throw it in the trash can. Again, I'm sorry to tell you that. It would warm my heart tremendously if the U.S. government changed its policy, but it's not going to happen on its own. I have seen so many really good causes think that that U.S. policy will be supportive of them just because they're a good cause. You look all over the world at very, very sad situations which on their own are not going to change U.S. policy. You need very capable advocates here in Washington. You need them in London. As I said, you need them in Paris, and yes, you even need them in Beijing. That is why I sound like a broken record on this unity business, because as long as there's many voices, all you have is a cacophony. When you have one voice, you get a message. When you have 10 different voices, all you get is noise. Again, as I said before, the Ambazonian issue is not one that is well known in Washington, because there are so many issues that people have to focus on. I looked around Washington. Yes, there are some individual members of Congress who are very interested. God bless them. They're members, of the congressional staff, and don't ever forget how influential congressional staffers are, because they're the ones who write the legislation. It's not the members of Congress, because most members of Congress have to spend their time soliciting, campaign financing for their next campaign. So, it's the staffers who write the legislation, and they need to be engaged with on a very strategic basis. So, as I said, issues do not sell themselves unless it's a major event. For example, Russia invading Ukraine. But these other conflicts in different parts of the world, they need advocates to change U.S. policy.
So, Mr. Ambassador, let me ask you this follow-up question. What shapes policy and action more, especially in cases like Ambazonia or Africa? Is it human rights? Is it interest?
It's all of the above, quite frankly speaking. I mean, the Ethiopian conflict is a major conflict, and that really gets people's attention because Ethiopia is a country of 110 million people. It's the anchor country in the Horn of Africa, and what happens in Ethiopia impacts not just the region, but also the Middle East, and fairly speaking, the entire globe, because it is such a major event. So people pay attention. The Ambazonia crises, people die, people suffer. The government was pursuing a policy which was absolutely disadvantageous to the Anglophone population, but it was not a high-level crisis which grabs people's attention. Look what has been going on in Eastern Congo for decades and decades. I believe that more people have died in the Eastern Congo than in the entirety of World War I. And yet no one feels an urgency to fix the conflict. And unfortunately, that is also the characteristic of the Ambazonia conflict, because number one, France has not been engaged with to change its policies. I tried, when I was Assistant Secretary, but I could find no interest. Two, when the United States of America looks at its relations with Cameroon, at the top of the list, yes, the human rights concerns in Ambazonia are very much at the top, but also at the top is the fight against extremism, which is going on in the Lake Chad area. So the United States sees Cameroon with one eye on the crisis in Ambazonia, but the other eye on the conflict with the larger regional factors in the north. So there are these complicating factors. It's not a left-right either or binary decision. There are more complications involved, and the more complications involved, the more of a selling job you have to do in Washington, the more of an engagement you need to do. So you add to that the disunity of the diaspora and the different messages that the members, the policymakers are getting. So the tendency then is to throw your arms up and say, you know what, we have enough problems in the world to worry about. We just don't have time to take away the layers of the onion, one peel at a time, to get to the bottom of this. Again, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I have to tell you guys the truth and the reality the way it is. So from the U.S. point of view, what happens in Europe takes precedence over what happens in Africa. Whether that's right or wrong, I can't say. I'm dealing with reality. I'm telling you the way it is. So that is how it looks. When you look at Africa, the U.S. and France in Africa, France's role in Africa at the top of the list is France helping in the fight against extremism in the Sahel. Now, France, as you have pointed out, has run into major difficulties there with Mali, with now Burkina Faso, and other places. Chad is one thing. So you have to look at the entirety instead of just looking at one little small piece of it. That's why, as I said, if you want to advance the cause, you have to engage, you have to educate, you have to be patient, because in effect you're turning a battleship around. And as we all know, battleships take a long time to turn around.
You have mentioned, Mr. Ambassador, you've mentioned France as having a lot of influence over Cameroon and their relationship with the United States. In some of your interviews to the Ambazonian people, you have suggested to them the pivotal role that France can play. And you've said, hey, look, I can be very honest with you guys, nothing can happen unless France is engaged.
Mm-hmm.
How can the Ambazonian people engage France? At the same time, France is trying to, to re-establish its relationship over Cameroon because of Russian influence over Cameroon. Mr. Biya is taking advantage of the crisis across the globe and try to leverage this international balance of power, so that his human rights abuses, cannot be sanctioned by either France or any of the members of the United Nations Security Council. That's why it's opted to have a military alliance with Russia as a counterbalance to that. So in your perception, in your experiences, how can the Ambazonian people leverage France and forget about the perception of France control over Mr. Biya?
Yeah, here's what I would say. Okay, I am not an Ambazonian diplomat. Okay, I don't represent Ambazonia as a diplomat. But if I were to push the Ambazonian case in Paris, I would sit down and figure out, the Venn diagrams that overlap each other, and you figure out in the overlap what are the common interests. So, you figure out, okay, what is France's interest in West Africa, and how could Ambazonia help French interests in West Africa? Excuse me. Would it be keeping Ambazonia as a bilingual country? Would it be opening up trade opportunities for France if the country was to become independent? Would it be protecting your coast? Would it be contributing to the fight against extremism? In other words, what would be in France's interest to be at least open or neutral regarding your case, and not to be opposing it outright? You see what I'm saying? Because I know that you have a great deal of sympathy, I think, in England among certain people. You probably have a great deal of sympathy in parts of Nigeria, even though the Nigerian government cannot be supportive because of their own fear of what could happen in Ogoniland, or what used to be called Biafra. So, those are the things that you guys have to take into account. And I'm not saying that you should organize a diplomatic corps right now, but in effect, if your goal is to have an independent country, then you have to consider what is it in the interest of key countries that would make them either be supportive or at least neutral and not in opposition to you. Because otherwise, all you're going to do is keep issuing letters and statements and declarations and things like that. And as I said, we can have the same conversation next year and in 5 years, and if God leaves me alive for 10 more years, and in 10 years.
Why would the United States consider Crimea an annexed territory and is not vocal to consider Cameroon present in Ambazonia an annexation?
Do you want the diplomatic answer or the real answer?
I want the real answer.
Okay, the real answer is that train left the station in 1961 or whenever. No one is going to go back to that. The Crimea situation happened, in the last few years. So, that is very much on the agenda of the world right now. Again, the Ambazonia situation in some respects is like Somaliland, because Somaliland, as you said in your intro, it was an independent state before southern Somalia became an independent state. But the big difference is Somaliland actually exercises full governmental control over its territory. It's a lot easier to make your case when you are running a de facto state, whereas in Ambazonia, like it or not, it's the government of Cameroon which exercises sovereignty, more or less. I mean, we all know the struggle that's going on the ground. So, unfortunately, those legal arguments can come into play later. Again, when you have a unified stand, when you're engaging with the international community from a unified point of view. But right now, you're basically, as I would say, shooting blanks out of a gun, because, the international community is just not going to take any action based on those arguments, no matter how justified. You can have a lot of academicians, who respect those. They will write wonderful academic papers, maybe even doctoral dissertations, but they will end up on the shelf.
Are we going to see somebody like Tibor Nagy, who have eaten African food, work our land, take on that role as a lobby for humanity's sake? For humanity's sake. And danced African dances. Don't forget that.
He also previously made a lot of comments citing the creation and the multiplication of the so-called interim government as the key factor in projecting a negative perception of the Ambazonian struggle to the international community. Being who you are, someone who loves truth, and I'm sure the Ambazonian people will appreciate you reiterating this concern.
Let me add one thing there. I wouldn't say negative. I would say confusing. Because, again, I have to say, I'm sure that each and every one of those interim governments, the motivation that is coming from them is very positive. That they probably all want the same thing. That is my point of frustration with them. It's not, in no way am I saying that any of them are a negative person. Only God knows the human heart. And I just have to assume that they're coming from wanting the best for Ambazonia. But at this very critical stage, disunity is a sign of confusion to the international community. And that's what has to be addressed.
And what's your advice to the multiplication, because they keep increasing their numbers? What would be your advice to these groups? My advice is, and I have spoken to several organizations in the United States, but maybe it would require somebody somewhere else to at least get representatives of them together and to start out by agreeing to something simple, like how many days are there in January? I know I'm being facetious, but that's why I was so frustrated with this declaration on October 1st that they couldn't even get together to agree on that. Something so that they could start building some sense of common purpose. Because and I know that they all want the same thing. Again, I cannot take a position on independence, federalism, things like I cannot take that position because that's up to your people. All I can take a position on is an end to the violence, the rights, the human rights, the dignified humanity rights of the people of Southern Cameroon's Ambazonia. So it is up to the people and their representatives to decide how to do that. So, maybe God can open these human hearts. If anybody can do it, God can do it. And get them to be willing to end up in the same room and to start, agreeing on some of these things so that they can engage together with the international community. Because that's what the Ambazonian people deserve. They don't deserve disunity. They don't deserve to be shaken down at roadblocks. They need to have their human dignity and their human rights
like people everywhere in the world.